consequences of working out the reasonable values that were exported into the colonial world throughout the 18th and 19th century, the consequence of that is the appalling contradiction presented by modernity, where the major portion of real wealth of great nations is shoveled into a standing crop of weaponry which had better never be used, because if it is used, it spells Armageddon. If it's not used, it's simply the worst investment anybody ever dreamed up. So this kind of betrayal of language and use of scapegoats, see, that's what was happening with the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The scapegoat, the godless communist. It's what was happening in the Putumayo between the rubber barons and the Indians they were exploiting. They thought they were civilizing them. So the imaging of the world gives permission for various kinds of relationships to it, and people never question. You know, once they pledge allegiance to a given linguistic model of reality, then that absolves all necessity for further thought. This is what Goebbels understood so perfectly. You repeat and you repeat and you repeat, and then when people ask themselves in the privacy of their own mind the moral question, your answer is on the surface, waiting to be heard. Goebbels was the first person to create a system where, sitting in an office in Berlin, he could throw a switch and speak to the German people. And this McLuhan talked a lot about this, the notion of the creation of the public. What is the public? It's something that comes out of print culture. It's post-medieval. It's a phenomenon that can only exist in the presence of newspapers, essentially. That's what gave it its boost. And the public is a very different thing from the democratic notion of the people, because the public is this body of quote-unquote informed opinion. But this informed opinion is tremendously subject to whim, pressure, propaganda, and distortion. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been following because we're so isolated here, but what is going on in China is right now totally Orwellian. Films are being watched in darkened rooms, people identified, located, dragged forward, forced to recant whatever accounts they gave of the violence. These film clips are being shown side by side on the evening news, where 3 weeks ago we were hearing that the army would never attack the beloved students. Now the army is patriotically rounding up dissidents, hooligans, bandit elements, and those who would destroy the compact between the party and the people. This is just a shift in language. Remember the scene in 1984 where the party hack is giving the speech, and midway through the speech he's handed a telegram on the podium that tells him that the enemy has changed. It's no longer Oceania. They've made peace with Oceania and have begun bombing Eurasia, the other state. And in mid-stride, he doesn't even have to end a paragraph. He can just turn the language and plow off in another direction. Well, is there any cure for this, or are we simply the prisoners, each of us in our own way, of people smarter than ourselves? Well, not really, I think, because outside the domain of language is some kind of domain of authentic feeling. We have thousands of words for technological processes, widgets, and what have you. Our vocabulary of feeling comprises about 10 words. You know, love, hate, disgust, revulsion, obsession, like that. Yet, in the same way that we are capable of this very intensely modulated brain state that translates itself into small mouth noises, we need to be aware of an internal horizon of self-perception that is extremely rich and complicated and shifting all the time. Now that's who we actually are. That is not the top-down values of the culture that we wear like clothing. That's who we are. This is what McLuhan said when he said we wear culture like an overcoat. It's something sold to us. You go out and buy it and you try it on. If Time magazine doesn't fit you, maybe The Economist will. If neither fits, well, try the Journal of Foreign Affairs. You'll find an overcoat that fits, and then that will become part of your culture. I saw the cartoon in the New Yorker last night, the well-dressed man and his wife leaving a party, and he's saying to her, "How can we relate to people who belong to the Book of the Month Club?" You know, these are strong cultural disparities. So to overcome culture, really, which I view as provisional and semi-toxic, there has to be a way back to bedrock, to something that is satisfyingly transcendental in an immediate sense. So it cannot be a philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe philosophies work for the more rarefied among us, and they have the consolation of, I don't know, Episcopalianism, Orthodox Judaism, logical positivism, whatever trip they've got running. But I've always found philosophy to be recreational and won't really serve. Well, so then what is there? First of all, there is nature. Nature silently attended is still a modality that is beyond the reach of the language of most of us, and of those of us who need it most fortuitously, because we have the smallest vocabulary for its description. So when we go into nature, it's a flirtation with a kind of iridescence. It's a search for, I blush to use such a word, but a lost innocence, which most of us associate with childhood. Some of us had terrible childhoods, so we just associate it with the lost paradise of Eden or a utopia. But in nature, there is an implicate order. There is the bedrock out of which the human iridescence springs. And human culture is an extremely evanescent, transitory, and non-equilibrium kind of condition. The pulse beat of this planet is measured in millions of years. Culture is a phenomenon of the last 40,000 years, and that's generous. So culture has about it this miraculous, instantaneous, and almost intrusive quality against the background of the rest of the body of nature. But going into nature is not simply a prescription for joining the Sierra Club. What going into nature means is taking seriously the alchemical faith that preceded the positivist flowering of science, and looking into the heart of matter with the expectation of encountering a mystery. Now, in the most practical sense, what this has to mean is the psychedelic experience. hallucinogenic plants. It cannot mean anything else. Now, of course, we're in the slightly uncomfortable position of having that be illegal. But that in itself should be a sufficient indication for most people that something is going on. I mean, my take on legality is essentially that of Charles Dickens, who was sort of an Edwardian anarchist. And his famous throwaway line on that was, "The law is an ass." And, you know, it's sadly true in this case. But I'm not really interested in it as a legal issue. I'm interested in it as a human rights issue, if you want to put it that way. In other words, my assumption is that in the same way that the Western mind reached a certain place where it recognized that slavery, whether it made economic sense or not, was morally insupportable, and in the same way then that a universal right to own property, if you've got the money, has been more or less institutionalized, and the oppression of women is now recognized as a kind of self-defeating strategy of male dominance. In the same way that these things have been signposts in the continuing history of human self-definition, so shall be the understanding that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the age of modern pharmacology has to mean the right to control your own state of mind in the appropriate, subject to the constraints of time, place, and manner, so forth and so on. So that's enough about the socio-political end of it. What is more interesting is the thing in itself, what it is, that it is something which our cultural biases, reaching clear back to the phonetic alphabet, and to the male dominance, the fear that societies run along the lines of male dominance have of boundary dissolution. I mean, for 1,000 years in Western civilization, the only boundary dissolution that was socially sanctioned was getting plastered. And that appears to have been specifically for the purpose of getting laid. I mean, as far as research can tell us, for 1,000 years nobody got laid who wasn't stone drunk, because everyone was such a paragon of social rectitude. Well, it's truer than you think. Alcohol is clearly a medium for permission in a Calvinist milieu. Well, I could talk about this in all kinds of different ways. It's very interesting. I talked about scapegoats, and I talked about the misuse of language. I suppose since I got that deep into it, I might as well say what I'm thinking, which is that the drug issue now looms as an obvious new horror. I mean, it has all the trappings of the communist under the bed. I mean, I have not yet heard crack cocaine referred to as godless, but any day I think the connection will be made that this is a godless drug. The problem here is, again, a problem of language. We have one concept, drug. It moves from aspirin to heroin through LSD and on into television. These things can all be spoken of as drugs. So then what this means immediately is somebody has stacked the rhetorical deck against a reasonable discussion of the matter because our vocabulary is so impoverished. I mean, are we to believe that we need the same policy for television as we need for heroin? Are we to believe that psychedelic psychotherapy is to be treated with the same hand that resolves the crack cocaine issue? So while the government squawks education, no education is taking place. Rather, what is taking place is a poisoning of the linguistic domain in which we will then be expected to forge a solution. So what I've tried to say on this issue, and some of you who saw this month's Mother Jones may have noticed that they put me in there, more picture than text, which tells you something about an age of symbols. But what I've tried to say is that we need to define drugs operationally. We need to say what it is we don't like, and then we need to find out what it is that does what we don't like. Okay, what is it we don't like? I submit to you that what we don't like about drugs is unexamined, obsessive, and habitual behavior. Unexamined, obsessive, habitual behavior. Meaning, somebody's into something, and by God, if you get in their way when they're on their way to it, you're in trouble. They do not question their obsession. They indulge their obsession, and they will tolerate no discussion of it. So unexamined, habitual, obsessive behavior is extremely objectionable to all of us, I think. I mean, we call anything that we don't like, we call it robot-like, automaton, unthinking, zombie, so forth and so on. Well, imagine if our partners in the new global materialism, the Japanese, had introduced into this country at the end of World War II a drug which within a few years made such deep inroads into the American population that people were spending an average of 5 hours a day loaded on this drug. What would we think? We would think that it was a crime against a culture on the scale of Auschwitz. But as a matter of fact, we did this to ourselves. Television, introduced at the close of World War II, has become a form of electronic heroin. And it isn't even your trip. They don't even let you go on your own trip. You get a trip designed on Madison Avenue to sell, this year's model of the crapmobile or whatever else is being pushed. So unquestioningly, and even as I speak, I'm sure there are people in this audience who are revolted at my lack of patriotism and love for an American institution of such nobility and depth as TV. Well, you know where I pulled back from TV? Really pulled back from it? It was when I made a mild knock on TV, and someone in the audience said, well, you can say anything you want about television, but you must admit that it's given our children a wonderful education concerning nature. Anyway, pursuing the theme of operationally defining drugs to give us a little more linguistic scope, psychedelics, in contrast to television and heroin, dissolve habitual patterns of activity and promote examination of motives and allow a restructuring of habit. Before LSD was made illegal, back in the 60s, very respectable psychologists such as Humphrey Osmond and Hoffer were obtaining 40% cure rate of chronic alcoholism with one high-dose exposure. Well, now understand, this doesn't mean that LSD is a cure for alcoholism. I mean, if you think that, you don't know anything about how drugs work. That 40% cure on one high-dose exposure to LSD of alcoholism means that this person took this psychedelic, it dissolved their boundaries, it dissolved their defenses, they came face to face with the fact that they were killing themselves, and when they came down, they reached into their bowels and found enough intestinal fortitude to chop it off. Well, this is real This is the dream of all other therapies. Now, AA achieves this, but at the cost of closing the mind. You know, a truly devoted graduate of AA does not have an open mind on the drug issue because they have been taught that opening your mind even a little bit may lead you back to the bottle. Well, they're trying to solve a personal dilemma in a context of neurosis. I'm sympathetic to that. But in the meantime, the rest of us have to try to make sense of these extremely complex issues, because the transcendent, which is what we cannot seem to find and what we are strangling for want of, lies precisely in the direction of this forbidden domain. What are we going to do about it? In other words, authentic, boundary-dissolving, internal hierophany does in fact reliably occur in the presence of these plants and compounds. But nobody knows what to do about it. We have become so accustomed to seeking the answer that even as a community, we have a lot of trouble figuring out how you just face the answer, how you come to terms with the options that are actually available. Well, I've talked about it today in a slightly more political context, because when you hang out in the baths with these State Department people, it's like a virus in the water. I mean, you find yourself raving about triage, Saudi uprisings, infrastructures. There's just no cure for it. Are there questions?